Friday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you as always. And when I say brief, I'm sure many of you, when you clicked on this video, you saw that this is a much, much shorter show than usual. And that is because I lost the file that I created or recorded the solo segments of the show on. That file corrupted immediately after I recorded it earlier. And I have attempted a couple of different times now to kind of make brief versions of that or different versions, but I've noticed I just get more and more frustrated trying to do that and keep scrapping it. So this is going to be very brief, if I'm being honest. And I apologize just for today's show not being what I wanted it to be for you guys. And I feel really bad, and it's been very frustrating trying to fix it. I initially wanted the show to be put out 2.5 hours ago, and that unfortunately will not be the case. But thankfully, I was able to salvage my interview with Dylan Sinn because that was recorded before the solo segments of the show, and that file did not get corrupted. So I do have that for you, and we'll cut to that here in just a moment. We talk all things Indiana basketball, a little bit of Purdue, and then previewing a little bit of Notre Dame versus Ohio State in the CFP championship next Monday. So again, apologies for just not having the show that I initially created for you. It stinks to have something that you've already done and it just disappears into thin air. And this is the first time I've had that experience with StreamYard. And I tried sending some messages to the help desk, that's what you call it, earlier, and they weren't able to do much for me. And I guess it just, that's the way things go sometimes. Bad luck or whatever you want to refer to it as. So without further ado, we'll just go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of this show, and that is Dylan Sinn of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, talking all things Indiana, Purdue, and Notre Dame as well. Joining us now once again from the lovely town of Fort Wayne, Indiana, it is none other than Dylan Sinn. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, my friend.
Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me on, and glad to be back.
Got a lot to talk about, and good and bad and ugly, or maybe it's just good and ugly, if we're being honest. We're going to start with the ugly, by the way, which is not usually the way things go, but it's definitely, at least amongst the people that watch my show, have been talking about frequently, and that's just what the hell is going on with Indiana basketball. And I don't know it's that big of a surprise as much as it is just disappointment with all of the hype coming around this roster so far, or, coming into the season, and you laid a few eggs early on in non-conference play, right? With what happened in the battle for Atlantis, and that was kind of getting the ball rolling for where we are right now. You gained a little momentum to begin 2025 with wins against Rutgers. And then I don't know why I'm blanking on the two opponents after that. You won 3 games in a row. You had USC before you ended up losing to Iowa on the road. And then you also, who was the middle opponent? Why am I blanking on who?
Well, it was Rutgers and USC, and there was
right.
Winthrop on top of that before the new year.
Yeah. So anyway, there was some momentum with where things were going for Indiana basketball before their most recent 2 matchups. Of course, one of them being a blowout at Iowa, and then you had what I think a lot of people thought would have been a good opportunity at home at Assembly Hall against an Illinois team that had just come off a loss to the USC team that Indiana had recently beaten. And you lay back-to-back eggs in what has become kind of the norm under Mike Woodson, these blowout losses. When you look at Indiana's losses for the entirety of 2025, or really 2024 and 2025 for the entire season, I should say, they're all blowouts. And I know the Nebraska game was close for a while, but it ended up being a 17-point win, I believe, for the Cornhuskers. So I guess I'll just start with this, Dylan. Why do you think the losses have always kind of turned into this for Mike Woodson-led Indiana teams?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, again, you said it with the Nebraska game. They were close until the end. It just seems like, especially this season, they really have trouble taking a punch. And I think Anthony Leal said that after the game against Illinois, was basically like, in order to win, you need to sustain runs from the other team. You need to be able to give up a run because that's going to happen, and
Yep.
then keep coming. And IU has not been able to do that this season. They actually did it somewhat against Iowa. They were down 15-4 early in that game, came back and took the lead, and then immediately gave up another 15-0 run, and it was pretty much over at that point. And I don't understand why this team has had so much trouble really punching back. When it gets down, things seem to spiral, and they just can't bring themselves out of it. I think it's because they don't really have an easy button, right? When they had Trace, you could put the ball into him and he was going to make a play, right? To stop a run. It's like in baseball, you're on a losing streak, but you have an ace pitcher. When it comes to his turn on the rotation, he's going to get you out of that losing streak, right? Indiana doesn't have a button like that they can press this year. Umar Ballo, I think, is a very good player. I think he's been unfairly maligned a little bit by some in the fan base, but he is not a guy who you can count on to get you a bucket when you really need one. He needs to be set up. You can't just give it to him and get out of the way, right? It's one of those, and they don't really have. Miles Rice is the closest thing they have to it where he can get to the rim, but there are times where he just kind of gets a little bit too fast. He turns the ball over, and sometimes that can make it worse, right? You're on an 8-0 run. He tries to get to the rim. Suddenly he turns the ball over, and they're going the other way, and it's worse, right? So I think that is the biggest thing is they don't have a guy who can really get you out of a run consistently, and they have to do everything by kind of teamwork on offense. There's not a guy who can get his own bucket on a regular basis. So that's the problem is sometimes they stagnate, and when they stagnate, the other team can go on a run and it can get ugly in a hurry.
And by the way, the game I was forgetting was the Penn State win at the Palestra.
Yes.
I don't know why I couldn't recall that one, but yeah, it's become quite an ordeal for Indiana to take losses the way in which they have. I said back in December that Indiana was kind of at a crossroads, and I thought that the way that things started out in January was going to be very indicative of how the rest of the season might go. I hate to jump to conclusions that early, but here's the thing. They had the momentum, they lost it. And now I feel like they're kind of at a crossroads once again, right? You have a very difficult stretch coming up. You have back-to-back road games beginning tonight against Ohio State. And then you have a big slew of a gauntlet, if you will, of games where you'll play 4 or 5 top 25 teams in a row if those teams continue to hold on to their rankings, of course. How do you feel about this team moving forward? Do you still think the NCAA tournament is a possibility? I know the wins are there if they can get them, but it's just a matter of can they get them at this point, or has it become more of a lost cause?
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where the wins are there, like you said, they're there to be had. There's just we have no evidence that this team is capable of winning games against that quality of competition. The Penn State game was great. Like I thought they had really turned a corner with that Penn State game, but I think it was more a function of Penn State just missing a bunch of threes. I think that's really what it ended up being. And then outside of that, we have no real evidence that not only can they beat teams of that caliber, that they can really compete with them, right? Like that's the thing. They got run off the court with basically the best teams they play. I know Providence is a decent team. I know South Carolina is a decent team, and I get that. So there's something there, but this team is obviously talented, but it hasn't proven it can even compete in these games, let alone win them, especially on the road. And so I just don't see it with this team. Like you talked about the crossroads. I think the crossroads was before the Illinois game. That to me was the game where if you were going to do something this season, didn't necessarily need to win, but you needed to go out there and
had to be competitive the entire
right. And they just weren't from Jump Street. It was over. And that is the type of thing where you had everything in your favor. You were coming off a loss. You had a couple of really tough days of practice, more than likely. You had a big crowd behind you with a student section back. You had a team coming in that was just coming off a loss itself. And so they're not invincible. We all know that. They had their freshman point guard was coming off an injury, and you just laid an absolute egg. Not only did you get blown out, they were down 30. 15 minutes
60 points at halftime they'd given up.
60 points. It is the worst. Like I was not covering the team Archie's first season when they lost by 20 to Indiana State. I was not there when they lost by 20 to PFW, but that was the worst game that I have ever covered from an Indiana or a Purdue team, quite frankly. It was awful. And it's one of those things where I'm sure these guys have some pride. Luke Goody and Anthony Leal were up there and they faced the music after the game. Good for them. They did what they needed to do as team leaders. But if you had pride, you would have come out and done something more against Illinois, I think. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's some reserve that they haven't tapped into yet, and we'll see it against Ohio State. but man, it was bleak in that game.
A question I had posed to some of the viewers, and I'm going to get to YouTube comments later on in the show after we finish up this segment, but and this may not be necessarily the best question for you to answer, but I am curious if you have some thoughts on this. If you're an Indiana fan right now and you're posed with two options, what would you rather see happen at this point? Option one is Indiana kind of fixes things in some way, shape, or form, goes on a run in the back portion of the season, gets into the NCAA tournament as like an 8-9 seed, something along those lines. The other option is the bottom just kind of falls out, and you know that you know it's time to move on from the Mike Woodson era and start over and just kind of see what you can do in the offseason to kind of revamp and start your program from scratch beginning next fall. If you're a fan, what do you think is the better option to maybe better is not the right option, but what do you think for the bigger picture of the program itself, I guess, what do you think is the better option potentially moving forward?
Yeah, so I have some perspective on that as I'm a Michigan football fan, right? I've been a Michigan fan my entire life. And so after 2020, when Michigan went 2-4 and everyone wanted to fire Harbaugh, they decided to keep him, right? And so going into 2021, Michigan fans had that exact same kind of perspective. It's like, do you want this season to go well because that means Harbaugh stays, or do you want it to just go badly and we'll just get rid of him and move on? And my thing as a fan has always been you root for your team to win, right? I even think like I even root for my professional teams that are tanking. I want them to win games. I don't care about the draft pick. Who cares? The third pick of this or the seventh pick, it's the same thing. You know, that you can make a good pick or you can make a bad one, right? You want your team to win. You're a fan of the team, right? If Indiana makes a run late in the season and gets 8 or 9 seed, that's a whole bunch of really good wins that they were able to get coming down the stretch of the season. That's fun. That's what being a fan is, right? I will never understand people who want the team to lose this badly. It doesn't make sense to me. I understand that you want Mike Woodson to be fired. I get it. But that to me is just not that's giving yourself a lot of short-term anxiety for something that might not even pay off long-term. It doesn't make sense to me. And so, yeah. And then I rooted for Michigan to win in 2021 and they made the dang college football playoff. So it's one of those things where I feel the same, like if they get an 8 or 9 seed and then that means that they have kind of unlocked some of the talent on this team, you win a first round game and suddenly you're facing a 1 seed in the second round. It's like, okay, we could do some more.
You have a chance at that point to kind of really reverse the narrative moving forward if you're able to. Because then at that point, not only have you beaten an elite team in the second round, you've moved into the second weekend, which Indiana hasn't done in nearly 10 years at this point.
Right, exactly. So like there is a chance, if the way it's set up right now, they're going to need to win a bunch of games in order to get to that point. And if you do that, then you can win some more. And suddenly you are achieving what you thought this season might. So, like, yeah, I am never going to tell people to root for this team to fail. That's just it's not how I operate. I don't think it's how other people should operate. Far be it from me to tell people how to be a fan, but that's just my perspective.
I think it's a really good response, but I do want to move on to a couple of other things. We'll move into Purdue and then we'll move into Notre Dame with the college football playoff national championship. But how do you feel like Purdue has made the most of their season so far? They're currently on, a 6-game winning streak. They're out on the West Coast. They beat Washington. They're going to take on Oregon tomorrow, I believe, for potentially another marquee victory for them. But how do you feel that they've adjusted to, I feel like I've asked everybody about this question that I've talked with Purdue about, but just life without Zach Edey and this kind of new look Purdue team?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's less that they were adjusting to life without Zach Edey, which obviously there was an adjustment there, to be clear, but they adjusted to that in the offseason. What they had to adjust to this season was the loss of Daniel Jacobson, right? Who was the 7'3" freshman center. He plays the first game. He has 13.7 rebounds and 3 blocks. And it's like, okay, we have our new anchor in the middle, right? And then he gets hurt, season-ending injury essentially, in the first minute of the second game of the season. And they struggled for a little bit to figure out what to do without him, right? Like, because they had built their team in such a way that they were going to have a post presence. Trey Coffin-Wren was going to play the 4. That was the plan, right? And so they've had to adjust on the fly, and it took a little bit. And now they've settled into a lineup where it's Trey Coffin-Wren and Caleb Furst in the front court. And that has really, really worked for this team. It's been really good. Caleb Furst, obviously I'm biased, the Fort Wayne guy. I've known Caleb for a long time, but he is playing fantastic basketball right now. He had, I think, 15 points and 6 rebounds and 4 steals the other night against Washington. It was really impressive. He just gives them kind of that versatility in the front court. He can switch multiple positions. He can get out and guard on the perimeter with long arms and be quick with his feet. It gives them a different dimension. And now that they've figured that out, it's allowed Braden Smith and Trey Kaufman-Renn to really be that kind of the pick and roll game that Zach Edey and Braden Smith were able to have last year. It's a different thing because Edey was going to the rim where Kaufman-Renn is trying to get into that like short roll and get into his 12-foot floater. But they've got something. They're one of the better offensive teams in the country. Their defense has improved significantly since first came into the lineup, and they're really, really good right now. I think they're probably the second or third best team in the Big Ten.
I was talking with Dustin Schutte the other day. He covers Purdue, and I asked him what he thought the ceiling was for Purdue. And I know whenever you're coming off of a national championship appearance, it's almost impossible to replicate that in back-to-back seasons. Excuse me. But he had mentioned to me that he still thinks that if this team achieves its full potential, it can still make a Final Four. Do you think that to be the case, or do you see it being somewhere a little lower than that?
It's interesting because I think they can beat anyone if they're making shots on a given night. I think their ceiling is that high. I just don't know how likely it is they get to that ceiling in the tournament, right? Because like it's tough to make shots like that 4 games in a row, and they can win games without it. But against the kind of caliber of competition they'd see in an Elite Eight or something like that, you're going to have to make some shots, and they can do it, but it's going to be one of those things where you're going to have a good night, and it's hard to predict that. I think probably the Sweet 16 is about where they end up, which, again, fantastic season. And the way I've framed this for people is that this is a 2-season journey for Purdue with this team. They are going to have basically an identical roster next year. There are no upperclassmen on this team except for Caleb Furst, who will be gone, but then you'll have Daniel Jacobson back next season. So basically,
again, all that is if nobody jumps in the portal. We always have to put an asterisk right there.
Yeah, yes, I will say Purdue has been really good the last couple of years at keeping key players around. Like they have not had a guy who they really expected to be part of.
Mason Gillis jumping to Duke was very weird this past offseason.
It was weird, but they knew it was coming. He had told them basically before last season, he and Ethan Morton, it was their last season at Purdue. It was either they were going to go to the pros or they were going to transfer, right? That's why they brought in such a big freshman class, and they were able to reload pretty quickly. So I think of it as a 2-season journey with this core, with Braden Smith, with Trey Kaufman-Renn, with Fletcher Lawyer. So you get to the Sweet 16 or even the round of 32 this year, I think you can say it's a pretty successful first act for this group. And then you go into next year bringing almost everyone back, and you're a preseason top 10 team, and you're right where you want to be.
That'll be interesting to follow along with, of course. Let's move on to what's happening this upcoming Monday, of course, and that is Notre Dame participating in the College Football Playoff National Championship against Ohio State. We've got to bring up this fun fact. I'm sure you've already heard this from somebody. I'm sure, Dylan. Indiana's only 2 losses, of course, to both teams participating in the national championship game.
Is that true? Is that true? I hadn't heard that.
As you say, I'm sure somebody has brought that up to you at least at some point, because it is a fun little thing to at least have in your back pocket if you're an Indiana fan. But on the Notre Dame side of things, to really kind of have them, when you look at where they were, of course, after the loss to Northern Illinois, and people are already, I mean, myself included, I'm not a Notre Dame fan, but just kind of thought the season may potentially derail for them. And many people thought that they didn't really have much of a path to the playoff because their schedule, up until we found out that Army and Navy were pretty good, didn't have a lot of marquee wins for them to really pick from. They took care of business, and they did what they were supposed to do in their different playoff games. And they end up upsetting Georgia in the second round, and then taking down Penn State, of course, as well. Now you find yourself going up against what's probably the other hottest team in the country, Ohio State, which their fans were ready to fire Ryan Day after the loss to Michigan in the end of the regular season. And now they look like they're primed to potentially win the entire thing. Going to be a very interesting matchup on Monday. What are kind of your thoughts on what to expect between the Irish and the Buckeyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a pretty good game. I do expect Ohio State to win. I know that that's not really breaking news. I think they're favored by more than a touchdown. I do think they'll win. I do think Notre Dame will keep it close, for at least for a while. I'm fascinated by the matchup between Notre Dame's pass defense and Ohio State's offense, which obviously is led by maybe the best receiver in the country in Jeremiah Smith. Notre Dame has really shut down basically every passing attack they've seen this year. You can run on Notre Dame a little bit, and I think Ohio State will to some extent. but they have shut down basically every passing offense they've seen this year outside of Louisville a little bit. And that was almost 3 months ago at this point. So
Yeah.
it's a really, really impressive team for Notre Dame. I think they probably just have too many injuries at this point. They've had so many injuries. And now, even against Penn State, they lost one and maybe two offensive linemen. So you're reshuffling your offensive line again a third time this season for the national championship game. So you might have a guy who was injured in the preseason in Charles Jagasaw, who they told us it's a season-ending injury, and he might be starting in the national championship game because he came back and played some snaps against Penn State and was like, okay, he looks pretty good, and he might have to start now because of injury. So it's an interesting situation they have. I do think Ohio State wins. I think it's a good game. And it's just a fascinating matchup to me because, as you said, both of these teams were just knocked down so far and have come back. I think that that's a really interesting kind of, all right, who's got one more in the tank? Because this is the longest season in FBS history, obviously. Who has the energy to still do this? And I think it's probably Ohio State, but I wouldn't count out Notre Dame.
If Notre Dame wins, what do you think is the difference maker?
I think it's probably a couple of turnovers. I think it's Will Howard making some mistakes against that pass defense, Xavier Watts or Leonard Moore getting an interception in a key moment. That's probably what would do it for me if I were predicting a Notre Dame win. I don't think Notre Dame is going to be able to get a ton of pressure on Ohio State with four guys. They're going to have to be creative with some blitzes they send and see if maybe they can bother Howard a little bit, who has been very, very good in this playoff, but he's also been known to make some mistakes. Even against Texas, he did that. So it's interesting. I do think I'm fascinated by the idea of Notre Dame is a man-to-man football defense. Like that they play straight up our guys against your guys. You cannot beat Ohio State that way. It can't be done. At least in my opinion. Maybe Al Golden, Notre Dame's defensive coordinator, feels differently. But if they try to play these guys man on man, and I like Leonard Moore a lot, I like Christian Gray, I think he's done a good job, but I don't think you can stop these guys. So they're going to have to play some zone. That's not their comfort zone. Can they get out? Can they get out of it and still execute?
I do want to ask you this. How do you feel with the playoff working out the way that it did? Two teams that had to play in the first round didn't get buys. And, of course, Notre Dame will never be able to get the bye because they're not in a conference.
Well,
do you think this?
Well,
oh, go ahead. If you've got something to add.
No. I mean, it seems like we're probably getting rid of the conference, like the conference buys.
For who gets a bye. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that seems like that's coming in 2020.
Whether it's next season or I doubt it's next season, but maybe the season after
probably
that.
The season after,
they did commit to doing this specific format exactly the way it is for 2 seasons, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Because the TV deal is up in 2025. So basically after next season, they have a new TV deal to renegotiate. So they'll probably spread some of the games around beyond ESPN. They'll probably change the format, most likely expand to 14 or 16 teams, and then most likely get rid of the automatic buys for conference champions, not the automatic bids. Conference champions will likely still get automatic bids, but they'll probably try to get rid of the automatic buys, would be my guess.
Yeah. The question I was going for, though, is do you feel like the way that the things played out with two teams who, of course, would not have been in a 4-team playoff, this justifies the expansion in the first place?
Really quick. I think Notre Dame would have been in a 4-team playoff. And I know that they were ranked 5th in the final rankings. However, I think that they seed it differently if they are seeding for a 4-team playoff. I don't think they put in Texas, who's already lost to Georgia twice in a 4-team playoff, to have a chance to lose to Georgia a third time. That's my guess, is that Notre Dame would have been in the 4-team playoff. I've seen that talking point a lot. Yeah. I just think it's probably incorrect. And I know.
But what's more valuable, though, there, just hypothetically, 2 losses to Georgia or a loss to a MAC team that was middle of the road?
Yeah, I get that. I do think probably they put Notre Dame in just because that's the thing, is mostly the reason that Texas and Penn State were ahead of Notre Dame is because they wanted to do this thing where they didn't penalize teams for losing a conference championship game, right?
Yeah.
But that wasn't a consideration in the 4-team era. We saw Georgia got kicked out last year. Just
Florida State still wins with their backup and they get left out. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. So I think Notre Dame probably gets into a 4-team playoff. That's why we needed the 12-team playoff, though, is because these conference expansion, it created so many teams with relatively similar resumes. It would have been really tough to split hairs like that. So once the conference is expanded and you got rid of the Pac-12, you really needed a 12-team playoff because more teams are similar and needed to kind of be able to settle it on the field.
Well, Dylan, I appreciate your time as always. Enjoy the trip down to, it's in Atlanta, right? The championship.
It is in Atlanta. That's right.
Enjoy the trip down to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and hopefully you get treated like a king down there as a as a middling media member for one of these two teams.
That's right. We're looking forward to it. Thanks, John. I really appreciate you having me on.
Big thanks to Dylan Sinn, of course, because without him today, we would have no show. And then also thanks for all of the wonderful information and insight he provides on Indiana, Purdue, and Notre Dame as well. I'm just going to go ahead and end this now because I know if I start rambling on like I tried doing in my previous attempts to redo the show, I will just get upset and then end up ruining this recording in a different way. So we're going to call it a week. No show on Monday due to Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I was initially going to do a show on Monday, but now I have some extended duties at my iHeart job that's going to keep me there a bit longer than I initially planned. So we'll not be doing a show on Monday, but we should have plenty to react to on Wednesday when it comes to football, basketball, anything, especially the Hoosiers. And I will try to hit on as much on Wednesday as I did today, especially if it's still relevant to different talking points, whatever it may be. Definitely the Indiana basketball stuff that'll be relevant throughout the season. But on the initial recording, I talked about Brian Haynes interviewing for the Penn State job and how that can potentially affect Indiana football heading into the rest of the offseason and, of course, in the next fall as well. And then talked about a number of other things as well. So, again, I am so terribly sorry that today's show is not what I wanted it to be, what I'm sure you wanted it to be, and it's just been very frustrating to deal with over the last couple of hours. And either way, and then lastly, I guess on a good note, tonight we will have a post-game wrap-up show. Myself and Dylan Traeger will react to everything that Indiana basketball is able to do or not do against Ohio State on the road tonight in some basketball action. So if you want to check that out, subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube, hit that notification bell if you want to know exactly when we go live, and look forward to hopefully talking about some good news, but wouldn't necessarily count on it based on some of the previous results that Indiana basketball has suffered through. So until then, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.